in what direction is the paradigm of psychology is evolving? What is the current paradigm in psychology? Basically, it is a systemic paradigm that tries to tackle the whole complexity of human beings. When Madsen tried to describe this meta-paradigm in 1988, he described it as an integrated biologo-socio-humanistic conception of human beings. So instead of trying to reduce everything to needs or stimuli reactions or some other biological drivers of behavior, instead of trying to explain everything with social processes, we try to integrate those perspectives and acknowledge the fact that human beings have biological nature, they also have social nature that influences us, and we also have some unique traits. We also have some unique values, unique views about life that we develop as we age, and all these are important to understand our behavior. And human psyche can be viewed as a hierarchical system of information processing, which is governed by probabilistic rather than deterministic laws. And in order to understand it, you need to use a more systemic approach. You need to take account of the context. And we will see how it happens very shortly. And in terms of methodology, also Madsen proposed that there would be pluralism, that quantitative and qualitative approaches would be used together as mutually complementing rather than as competing. Because when people adhered mostly to natural scientific view, of course, qualitative approaches such as interview studies, they were not considered to be very scientific. But nowadays, when we try to get a more systemic view, we realize that qualitative and quantitative methodology are basically equally scientific, potentially. So what does it mean, a systemic approach? What does it mean taking into account the context? This metaphor was proposed by a German psychologist, Jürgen Kritz. He said that behaviorist approach treats human being as an isolated object. So if you want to understand how far a box will move, if you kick it with your foot, you can actually easily predict it if you know the weight of this box and if you know the force with which you kick it. In the same way, behaviorists try to explain human behavior in terms of stimuli and reaction. They try to explain all of our reactions based on stimuli. If you know the stimulus, you can predict what will happen. But in reality, for example, when we do psychotherapy, we can never predict whether our psychotherapeutic intervention will have a certain effect on a certain person, because it depends on their life circumstances, on what situation that person is. So a metaphor could be, imagine a ball rolling through the landscape. If it rolls in a ravine, you would need a lot of force in order to change its direction. But if this ball is on the top of some hill, perhaps a very, very small influence will be needed to change the direction in which it will roll, because it's in the point of this instability. So a human being is constantly under the influence of a context, and we need to take account of this context in order to understand and predict behavior. And also, human being is a complex being, and this biologo-socio-humanistic view of human being basically translates into this multi-level model of human being. This model was described by Ken Sheldon in his book, Optimal Human Being, which you can read a bit from. But it's basically very simple. It's basically very straightforward. The idea is actually very simple. We can take a look at different levels in which we are organized. The most elementary level is that of atoms, that is studied by physicists. Atoms are organized into molecules that are studied by chemists. Molecules are organized into cells that are studied by microbiologists. Cells are organized into tissues. One of the tissues is nervous system. And further up, we have the level of cognitive processes, the level of personality, and the level of social interaction and that of culture. How are those levels different? First of all, they are different in terms of space and time scale. If you look at atoms, you will probably face objects at the level of nanometers and nanoseconds. But if you go up those levels, for example, at the level of tissues and nervous system, you already get milliseconds and micrometers and millimeters. Then at the level of cognitive processes, you have already processes that take hundreds of milliseconds. At the level of personality, you have processes that take maybe seconds and hours. And if you go further up, for example, to the level of culture, you have processes that span thousands and millions of individuals. They have very large spatial scale, and also in terms of time. Cultural processes take decades to get changed. If you want to see how cultural values evolve, you need to monitor the culture for at least 10 or maybe 20 years to see some change trends. So those processes have different scales in space and in time, and we acknowledge that they all exist and they all influence our behavior. So the classical natural scientific approach to explanation would be to explain the upper level process with lower level process. And now we call it reductionism. So reductionists would try to reduce a complex behavior to more simple process. So for example, if you ask a behaviorist, why do people during the break, why do they go out to the canteen and get a hamburger? And then behaviorist would say, okay, well, it's very simple. Because we all have stomachs. In our stomachs, we have receptors. And those receptors react to the chemical composition of the environment in our stomach. And then the signal, when there is a certain level of acidity, which suggests that something needs to be put in our stomach, then this signal goes up into our brain. And then it triggers a bunch of reactions that we have learned during our lifetime. We get some money, we go to the canteen, we pay the money, we get the hamburger, we eat it, we're satisfied. Hooray. But then you could also ask a question, why does John get a hamburger and why does Joan get, for example, a Coke? Or why does one person go into the canteen, another person goes into McDonald's, a third person goes into a Japanese restaurant and has sushi, and the fourth person says, I don't really care where to go. I will go wherever my friends go, because there I can have a chance to talk with them and we can spend some time together while also satisfying our need for food. And in order to understand those individual differences, it's not enough to actually go down. You need to go up to the level of personality preferences, to the level of social interaction, and maybe even to the level of cultural standards to explain why this particular behavior takes place. So within this systemic view of human being, we say that actually different levels, they have equal causal status. There can be causality that goes from the bottom up, but there can be also causality that goes from the top down. So when we try to understand why people fall in love, it's not enough for us to say that it's because of the hormones. But why do people fall in love in this particular way? In different cultures, the very concept of love can be very different, and the behavior of people who fall in love can be extremely different. And in order to understand it, we need to actually take account of some anthropological, sociological data, and obviously, of course, personality level, because the outcomes of relationships are influenced by personality traits, by the combination of personality traits of both partners, and so on. The cognitive process, of course, how do people interpret their own behavior, their feelings. So you can go to different levels, and of course neuroscientists would say, let's put a person into MRI and ask them to think about the person they love and see what parts of brain are activated. So all those different levels will contribute something to our understanding of love. But if you want to really conduct a good research, you need to try to combine different levels, because you want to try to have a complex picture of what's happening. So, of course, in our research, we usually maybe are confined to just one level. But it's okay. The problem is when we try to ignore everything and when we say that our level is the only one that exists and the only one that matters. So if, for example, you encounter a biologist who says that everything in our behavior is based on neurons, well, this is true, but it is only a part of the truth. and you always need to have in your head this bigger picture that you can see on these slides. So in a more funny way, we can put it as an opposition between soft science and hard science. Soft science, like sociology or psychology, is a science where there are no laws, or maybe laws only have very relative probabilistic nature. Because if you ask a psychologist how a person will behave, a psychologist will definitely say, oh, this depends. It depends on so many things. It depends on their dispositions. It depends on the social situation. It depends on the neural patterns and on so many things. Whereas if you ask, for example, a physicist or a chemist how a chemical reaction will evolve, they will probably be able to give you very specific laws that govern this process. So that is hard science. Sociology and psychology is soft science, but it is no less scientific, because sometimes you can see people with a background in physics who say, psychology is a weird science. It is not very scientific. But they say so because their ideal of science is based on natural sciences. And natural sciences, they study objects that are inanimate or maybe animals, but these objects of research are much more simple than human beings are. For example, if you are a geologist studying some kind of stones, you can take any piece of stone from the mountain that you're interested in, and it will be equally good as your research object. Or if you are a biologist studying, for example, frogs, you can take basically any frog from the population, and it will be okay. But if you are a psychologist, everything depends. If you are studying something very simple, something that is very universal, for example, the neural patterns of reaction to certain very simple stimuli or elementary process of perception, of course, every human being will be okay for your research. But if you are studying something that develops during our life, there is a lot of individual diversity. Because human beings have a lot of degrees of freedom. And then this whole relativity comes in, because everything, for example, if you're interested in love, how does a person understand love? It will depend on their culture, it will depend on their background, it will depend on their life circumstances, what kind of experiences they have had with love, and so on. So this is when you will answer, it all depends. And your answer will be scientific because you're aware of this whole complexity and you're aware of the big picture. Now, what is special? What is special about human being as a research object? There are three things that make human beings special as research objects. First of all, this complexity. Second, human beings are active. And the third thing is that human beings develop. They develop throughout lifetime. We change, and we are all very different. What does it mean for our research? Well, the fact that we are complex objects, complex agents, it means that we are biological agents. When we are born, we have certain biological needs. We have certain instincts, although there are debates whether the whole notion of instinct is applicable to human beings. We have some inborn properties of our central nervous system. Some of us are born more extroverted, other ones are born with a disposition to be more introverted. And those things, of course, influence our behavior. But how we will behave, this also depends on the social level. Because as we grow up, as we age, society imposes on us some social roles, some social norms that shape our characteristic behavior. For example, if you are born as a very strong introvert, but you grow up in a family among extroverted parents, you may have learned to behave the way extroverts do, and you may not even be aware that your nervous system has these dispositions towards introversion, because you have learned to behave the way extroverts do and you value this behavior. And then there is the third level, the individual or personality level, when personal values and meaning come into play. And this level is kind of optional, because in order to function well in a society, it is actually enough to have appropriated the social norms and the social roles. But then when you ask a person a question who they really are deep within themselves, a person who functions basically on this social level, they will describe themselves in terms of social groups or social roles. But if a person has grown as a person to this level of being an individual, of being a personality in a narrow sense, they will give you an answer in terms of what is really important to them, what makes their life meaningful. And this also shapes their behavior. This also shapes their choices in some important life situations. And how it works in research. For example, when we ask a question about human motivation, why did you do this about a certain behavior? For example, why did a person behave in an aggressive way? You can give different explanations. You can use different theories that will explain the same behavior. For example, you can refer to theories of needs, and you can say this person has a need for aggression, or they felt a desire to behave in this way. You may refer to dispositions or personality traits, and you say, okay, they always act this way in most situations, and in this situation, this behavior was typical. Or you can refer to situational characteristics and use an explanation in terms of stimuli reactions because something provoked them. Or you can refer to the to social norms, and you say, okay, the group in which this person grew up in, this was a normative behavior in that group, so everyone does it, so do I. And if we look at these first four explanations, probably at least 80% of our psychological research uses them. When we use questionnaires that measure personality traits or that measure needs, or when we use situational approach to explain behavior, we use social psychological approach with reference to norms and conformism and so on, we rely on these first four explanations. And these explanations explain the typical patterns of human behavior. But luckily, our behavior is not always typical. There is also some individual uncertainty, and this individual uncertainty is based on more advanced mechanisms of self-regulation that develop during the lifespan. For example, meaning. Sometimes when we explain important life choices, the only explanation is because this person felt that it was important to do it. It was important in the light of their values, in the light of who they feel they really are. And this is why they made those choices. You cannot explain it in terms of needs or disposition because it's a unique situation, or in terms of social norms because it was a unique behavior. For example, why did Viktor Frankl choose to stay in Vienna when he could leave to avoid the persecution by Nazis? But he stayed, and he was placed into a concentration camp because he felt it was important for him to take care about his elderly parents. And if you know his life story, you know that this decision was very difficult for him, and it came to him almost unconsciously at some point. And finally, there is an explanation through human freedom. Sometimes people do things because they choose to do it. Sometimes when we attempted to behave in an automatic manner, we stop ourselves and we think and we make a decision that is based on our pre-existing knowledge and dispositions and our past experience, but maybe it is not fully determined by them because there is this gap where freedom is possible. Of course, in most situations we behave automatically, but sometimes we make individual unpredictable choices, and it is those choices that actually shape who we really are. Luckily for us as researchers, in most people's behavior in most situations can be explained by very simple patterns like needs or reactions or norms. But if you want to explain individually unique situation, individually unique behavior, you need to use more complex research approaches that take account of individual differences, of individual meanings, of individual freedom. And the main problem is that if you have a bunch of people who engage in exactly the same behavior, different people may perform the same behavior for different reasons. Some people can do it because of dispositions, other people can do it because of needs, still other people can do it because of norms, because they think that this is the right thing to do, because everyone does it. Still other people may feel that it is personally meaningful for them to do it. So when you try to explain people's behavior, you need to be aware of this possible diversity, that the same explanation will not work for everyone. Because human beings are developing agents, because we age, we are born as biological beings, and then as we grow up, we are socialized. We appropriate to some extent or other what our social group is trying to impose upon us when we study at school, for example. And of course, a person may fail to appropriate the social norms, and then they will function on a more elementary level, an impulsive level, we can say, in terms of ego development theory. But then, of course, they are very likely to get into jail because they are unable to function in line with the social norms, as we are all trained to. So this social level is kind of necessary. But then there is the cultural level, the level of individually unique behaviors. And this level is kind of optional, because many people can live through their life just by following social norms without asking themselves a question: who they really are, what is really important about their life, what is the meaning of their life, what kind of path they should follow in life, and why. You can actually avoid asking this question and you can be fine. But in case if there is a social crisis, social norms change and they don't work anymore, people who function at the social level, they suffer because their world is shaken. And this is what happens to many people when Soviet Union collapsed. This is why in Russia we had such a growth of suicides and such a growth of alcoholism and all the other problems throughout 1990s, because many people basically failed to adapt to the new reality when whole old social norms, social values, they have collapsed. Only when people had some vision of their values, they could find their way in this new reality. So this is the second characteristic of human beings, developing agents. And the third characteristic of human beings is that we are all active. We are constantly active and we are constantly reflective. Instead of just receiving external stimuli, we ask ourselves questions. What does it mean to me? What it is all about? What life is all about? And based on these questions, we form opinions, we form views that shape our behavior. For example, in any experiment that you conduct, people, of course, ask themselves the question what your experiment is about. So unless you give them a certain explanation, they will ponder, and some people may actually guess what your experiment is about. And then this may change the way they react to your stimuli. And this is why after an experiment, we usually conduct a post-experimental interview and we ask a person, how do you think, what this experiment was really about? And if a person has guessed, the good approach is to remove them from your sample because they are not naive subjects anymore. And of course, if you give people some information about their behavior, for example, there is a publication in research in popular journals. They say in the news, oh, psychologists have discovered that people behave in this way because of so-and-so. Tomorrow, people read this article and they start thinking when they do this, why do we do it? Are we really like all those other people who are described in this psychological research? And their behavior kind of changes. So the knowledge that we gain about our behavior changes our behavior. This is why you should never give feedback to your participants before your study is over. wait until your study is over, and only then you can tell them what your study is about or what their scores on personality questionnaires are. So how can we deal with all this complexity of human beings? As biological beings, we are all alike. As social beings, we are all kind of more or less alike, but not quite, because it depends on our social group, on our culture, on our background, and so on. But then as individuals, we are all different because we all have different life experiences, we have different values, we have different meanings, and depending on what your research question is about, you probably need to use a different research approach. So what research approaches are available to us as psychologists?